Hello everybody again, and welcome to the third part of our video series. Today we're going to learn about the two key hormones directly affected by compassionate behavior. Not only that, we're also going to start putting into motion our amazing pulley system. To do that, we're going to need the information from the first two videos, so let's do a quick review. All right. As I'm sure you remember, in part 1, we learned that compassion means to pass through intense emotion together. And that is the way in which we actively and consciously connect with other people. In part 2, we learned that humans are born with brains which are only 10% of the way developed. 90% of our brain development then takes place after birth. The brain develops based on the surroundings and environment it is in. When the environment is not ideal, the brain creates adaptations as protection. These adaptations help in the short term, but in the long term, these adaptations lead to problems with mental health, physical health, and the ability to learn. And finally, we learned the more a particular brain function is repeatedly stimulated, the stronger the neural connection is created. Remember the story of the mice in the hotel? And lack of repeated stimulation leads to weak neural connections or altogether non-existent neural connections. Good? All right. So we'll start tying all this together near the end of the video. But first, we need to add one last important ingredient, which is knowledge about the two key hormones. Let's go. First up, let me introduce you to the stress hormone cortisol. Here's what he looks like chemically. But for our purposes, it might be easier to imagine cortisol more like this. A bad guy. You see? When we are exposed to stress and cortisol for extended periods of time, it creates a debilitating environment in our bodies. Now, I would like to point out that cortisol is not evil by nature. Cortisol actually serves an important function when we are faced with dangerous situations. Cortisol helps fuel our body's fight or flight instinct when facing a crisis. For example, let's say you were going for a walk out in nature, and then all of a sudden, you notice a lion's creeping up on you. Ladies and gentlemen, in the role of creeping lion, Maté Kayak.
Marek.
Back to creeping. All right, and all of a sudden, it's creeping up on you. Now, how did I manage to escape? Well, when faced with danger, it's cortisol that's responsible for telling our body to send extra energy to the muscles in our arms and in our legs. And that is where we get the strength to either escape or to fight the danger off. Once the danger has been avoided, cortisol levels drop back to normal and energy becomes evenly distributed through our bodies once again. Now, the problem with cortisol, or Señor Cortez as I like to call him, is when we marinate in it for longer periods of time. And why is that bad? Well, remember how just a moment ago I said that in dangerous situations, cortisol helps send extra energy to the muscles in your arms and legs so that we have enough energy to fight or escape? Well, that energy doesn't just show up out of thin air. The body actually shuts off other functions inside the body, conserving that energy, and then sends that energy to your muscles. And that is where we get the energy to fight or escape, at the cost of lowered internal body functions. What vital functions does our organism limit or shut off to conserve energy? Well, let's take a look. Maintenance of the body, functioning of the internal organs, growth and cellular repair, maintenance of the immune system and higher brain functions. That means functions that are handled by the part of our brain called the neocortex. That last point about shutting off higher brain function is a big one, because when Senor Cortez here limits our higher brain function, our ability to learn and process new information is compromised. Rational thinking becomes impaired. And since compassionate and empathetic behavior has been found on brain scans to light up sections in our neocortex, this means our ability to use and develop compassion and empathy becomes greatly limited. And that is the problem that cortisol causes in our bodies. All right, everybody, we've finally come to that exciting moment where we will start putting our amazing pulley system into action. So come with me. In the center here, we will place compassion, which, as we know, is the way to create active and conscious connection. And next to that, we will place cortisol. When we find ourselves facing a stressful situation, having someone there to compassionately connect with us, either by physically helping us, guiding or educating us, or simply by being by our side, lowers our cortisol levels. Conversely, when we do not experience connection, our cortisol levels rise. And as we just learned, cortisol directly affects what? That's right, the strength of our organism and immunity. And we will place that here. When cortisol levels rise, strength of organism and immunity go down. When cortisol levels go down, strength of organism goes up. Are we starting to see the biological importance of compassion? Well, I hope so. All right, so moving on from cortisol, the bad guy in our story, it's time to introduce to you the good guy in our story. And that good guy is, ta-da, dopamine. Dopamine is absolutely vital for our life. And let me tell you why. And please pay attention to this part. You see, most people are not even aware that this important hormone exists. And the few that are aware generally only know him as a feel-good hormone, or they'll say that it's the hormone of reward. While these 2 points are true, they absolutely fail to convey dopamine's important role in our lives. So, what all is dopamine responsible for in our lives? Dopamine is responsible for our energy regulation, motivation and achieving goals, the ability to pay attention and learn. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and so the presence of dopamine is responsible for the smooth and efficient transmission of electrochemical signals, meaning overall function of your entire brain is dependent on proper dopamine levels! Exclamation point. Furthermore, dopamine plays a role in blood flow, digestion, heart and kidney function, memory and focus, mood and emotions, motor control, pain processing, pancreatic function and insulin regulation, pleasure and reward-seeking behavior, and finally, sleep quality. Holy cow! That is how important dopamine is for our entire lives. So, now we see that dopamine is involved in just about everything that goes on in our minds and bodies. And to really drive the point home about just how important dopamine is, let me tell you about an experiment that scientists did on a mouse. In the role of lab mouse, please welcome to the stage, Marek Hayek.
Marek.
So, in this experiment, scientists disconnected all the dopamine receptors in the mouse's brain. Meaning, dopamine was taken completely out of the picture. The scientists fed the mouse directly placing a little bit of food in front of the mouse's mouth. But what do you think the scientists discovered when they put the food a bit farther from the mouse? After 2 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours, the mouse did not go eat any more food. Of course, the mouse had to be hungry. So why didn't the mouse go eat? It was in no way tied down. Are you tied down, dude? Then there was nothing blocking the path to the food. The key factor in this was that the dopamine and all its functions were taken out of the picture. Without dopamine, the mouse had zero motivation to eat. Without the chemical reward of a dopamine release, not even hunger and physical survival was enough to motivate the mouse to go a few centimeters and fulfill such a simple and critical task as eating a few bites of food. That is how vital dopamine is for our bodies and lives. Lots of exclamation points. So, with all that information in mind, we're back at our fantastic pulley system. And we will place dopamine here. And because dopamine affects our energy, motivation, and attention, etc., 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 we will place this here. Because dopamine directly affects those. Now you may be thinking to yourself right now, hey Daniel, I understand how cortisol levels are affected by the presence or lack of compassion. But how do we know that dopamine is affected by the presence or lack of compassion and connection? Well, get ready for the last part of today's video. Are you ready? Because the science experiment I'm about to share with you will change your life forever. So, in this experiment, scientists took a mama monkey and her baby and a sort of dopaminometer measuring contraption that probably didn't look exactly like this. But anyway, they hooked the baby up to the dopaminometer to measure the dopamine production in its brain. While the baby was in connection with its mama, that means seen by her, protected by her, and taken care of by her, the baby's dopamine levels were at high, healthy levels, meaning enough dopamine was being produced. The scientists then took the baby away from its mama, and by day 4 of being disconnected from its mama, dopamine production dropped drastically. When they gave the baby back to the mother, dopamine production and dopamine levels went back up to healthy levels. And again, when they were separated, dopamine production dropped, and when they were reunited, dopamine levels in the baby's brain went back up to high productive levels. Thus, scientists concluded that connection amongst mammals directly affects the proper production and levels of dopamine in the brain. And now, here is the kicker. Remember from the last video that whatever is repeatedly stimulated produces strong neural connections, and that what isn't repeatedly stimulated produces weak or non-existent neural connections. Well, if we have been exposed to repeated states of disconnection in the first years of our life, like the baby monkey, that means our dopamine production was oftentimes lowered or shut down. Our dopamine neural circuits were not getting regularly used and stimulated. And that lack of repeated use in childhood then leads to a weak and poorly developed dopamine system in our adult brains. We grow up to be living with a poorly functioning dopamine system. Meaning that everything on that huge list of functions that dopamine plays a role in is running in weakened and even highly weakened states. Similarly, like the mice, from the story in the hotel who ended up blind because their visual circuits were not stimulated by light while growing up in darkness, we grow up to have a weak little stream of dopamine trying to do its best to fulfill all of its important functions. Oh my God, right? So now let's go and finish up this video back at the pulley system. All right, so we're back at the fantastic pulley system, and now we know, thanks to that experiment, for a fact that compassion and connection directly affect dopamine production and the dopamine brain circuits. And with that, we can sum up what we have learned here today. And that is, when we experience compassion and quality connection, especially in childhood, we have much healthier amounts of dopamine and cortisol pulsing through our brains and bodies, meaning we have good energy regulation, motivation, the ability to pay attention, etc., 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 and the strength of our organism and the strength of our immunity are high. When we do not find ourselves in adequately compassionate and connected relationships, especially in childhood, we have lower dopamine levels and higher cortisol levels, which result in the debilitating state of lowered energy, lack of motivation, and an inability to pay attention, and also the debilitating state of a weakened organism and weakened immunity. And that, my friends, is all I have for you today. I'm going to end this one on kind of a down note, kind of like in Star Wars Empire Strikes Back, where Luke gets his hand cut off and finds out Vader is his dad and everything is just bad news. But tune in next time, and I'll show you what our bodies do, completely without our conscious knowledge, in an attempt to deal with these debilitating states. Take care, my friends, and I'll see you next time.